Hello from the other side of endometriosis excision surgery. After 22 years of begging doctors for information about my pain and having to be satisfied by the tiniest crumbs of data on my own body, suddenly I have so much information, it's hard to process. I have photos of my uterus and fallopian tubes and ovaries and the endometriosis that was on them. I have lab pathology results from the samples that they took. I have a surgeon's explanation of what he found and what he did in there. And I have one less fallopian tube than I did 4 weeks ago. For the first time in over 2 decades, I finally get detailed, definitive answers to basic questions like, what is happening inside my body when I get death cramps? And why didn't birth control help my period pain? Over the next 2 episodes, I'm going to take you through all the steps that led to my decision to get surgery, my experience of the surgery itself, recovery, and the answers that I have now. Because frankly, I wish there was an episode like this that I could have listened to before my surgery. So buckle up.
What's happening to your body, we don't know, because we've never really studied the female body. Say it's all in my head, but the research is quite spotty. No, we've never really studied the female body. Dismissed. Try losing weight, you're just anxious. That's fine, that's cool, I'm not pissed. Just wait 10 years for a diagnosis. Psychosomatic, you're so dramatic. Hysterical, emotional, hormonal, erratic. Heart disease, chronic fatigue, depression and anxiety. Do you have pain? No, you don't, because we've never really studied the female body.
Welcome back to CRAMPED, the podcast where I try to find answers to my and other people's questions about their period pain. I'm your host, Kate Helen Downey. If you just found this podcast, you might want to start from the beginning of season 1 to get the whole story of my death cramps, some of the history of women's healthcare, and the reasons why we've never really studied the female body, like the song says. If you would like to support this podcast, and we really do rely on your support as a completely independent show, you can do that via our Patreon at patreon.com/cramped. Patreon members get bonus episodes, as well as access to our Discord community full of other crampers sharing their own experiences and information that's helped them. And just a quick reminder, I am not a doctor. This is not medical advice. Everything presented in Cramped is my own and other people's personal experiences. I am just a research nerd with a uterus and a microphone, and I'm sharing what I've found. And today, what I have found, after 21 years of unexplained and untreated severe period pain, 1 year after getting my endometriosis diagnosis, and 6 months after starting to share my story and my research with all of you, I found surgery. This episode will cover the path to my decision to get surgery and the preparations for surgery. Next episode will cover the surgery itself, recovery, and the new information and answers that I got. So here we go. Back in June 2024, I saw an endometriosis specialist to see if, despite every doctor telling me that I definitely didn't have endometriosis, I might, in fact, have the disease that matched up with all my symptoms. And it turns out, based on my history, symptoms, and my exam, this endometriosis specialist diagnosed me with endometriosis. You might remember this from episode 5 of season 1. As part of that initial exam, I had an ultrasound done. My doctor let me know that sometimes endometriosis lesions can be seen on an ultrasound, but even if they don't see any, that doesn't mean I don't have endometriosis. Which was reassuring, considering that every ultrasound I'd ever gotten in the past had come back showing nothing out of the ordinary and had always been a dead end in my search for a diagnosis and treatment. This ultrasound also showed everything as pretty much normal, with just some slightly strange things like less follicles on my right ovary than on my left. My endo specialist basically said, yeah, that could be from endometriosis scarring, or it could be from something else, we don't know. Not seeing any endometriosis on the ultrasound didn't change her mind that I had endometriosis. And despite being a surgeon, she recommended not going straight to surgery. The most important thing, she explained, was to address the layers and layers of inflammation, pelvic floor dysfunction, and nervous system dysregulation that had built up after years and years of untreated pain. She recommended that I see an endo-knowledgeable nutritionist, a pelvic floor physical therapist, and that I stop doing any kind of intense workout that might be stressing out my already stressed out body, and instead do things like gentle yoga and walking. She also gave me a list of other specialists, like an endo-informed fertility specialist and a pain management specialist. None of these were covered by my insurance, and I couldn't afford to do all of them. So I prioritized the nutritionist. After learning how endo was likely causing my chronic bloating and constipation that I had never connected to my period pain, and I decided to go to the pelvic floor physical therapist after I learned how endo inflammation and pain can cause a vicious cycle of the pelvic floor muscles tightening and making that pain worse. Working with the nutritionist, I got tested for SIBO, which I very much had, and probably had for decades. SIBO stands for small intestinal bacteria overgrowth, which is very common in endo patients because the inflammation from endometriosis slows down your digestion, which allows bacteria to go nuts on the food that has been sitting in your small intestine much longer than usual. My endo specialist told me that 90% of her patients have some kind of GI dysfunction because of endometriosis, either from adhesions that are pulling the intestine or the colon in a weird direction, or just from the inflammation. I took antibiotics for my SIBO, and I felt better, but my SIBO symptoms came back, so I learned how to eat a low FODMAP diet in order to stop the bacteria in my small intestine from growing without taking more antibiotics. I started meditating, even though I really don't like it. I continued seeing my therapist, I stopped running and doing HIIT workouts, and I opted for long walks and yoga instead. All of this, combined with unraveling my pelvic floor muscles in physical therapy and reducing overall inflammation, helped calm my nervous system down and turn down the volume on a lot of my symptoms. But it didn't address the root cause of my pain and inflammation, the endometriosis itself. Those spots of endometrial-like tissue that were implanted somewhere in my pelvis. I didn't know where they were, I just knew that I still had pain and bloating and fatigue and digestive issues, no matter how much I tried to minimize the stress on my body and control the things that I could control. Now, something else was happening this whole time, something that I haven't talked to you about yet. My husband and I had started trying to have a baby a few months after I got my endometriosis diagnosis. After getting my diagnosis, I knew that it was possible we'd have trouble conceiving, that endometriosis can cause so many different issues that make it difficult or impossible to conceive. Having the information that I had endometriosis, but not having any more detailed information about where my lesions were located, what damage they had done over the last 2 decades, that was kind of driving me nuts. It's a real Schrodinger's endometriosis situation. But the ultrasound hadn't shown any clear or obvious evidence of damage, and my doctor hadn't suggested any further imaging. So it was a mystery. I would get frustrated every month I got my period, partly because I was still having severe pain most months, even if it wasn't full-on death cramps, and now partly because I wasn't getting pregnant, despite all the money I was spending on a nutritionist and a pelvic floor physical therapist, all the lifestyle and diet changes I had made. All of that effort and money didn't seem to be making a big difference. I also knew that it's pretty normal for it to take a year or more to get pregnant, even if everything is working fine. So we just kept trying. I got my blood work done to check for any potential non-endometriosis problems, and my husband got his sperm checked, and everything came back A-OK. After 9 months of trying, I just knew that endometriosis was the problem. I didn't want to keep trying for another 3 months before seeing a fertility specialist. So we made an appointment with the endo-informed fertility specialist that my doctor had recommended back when I got diagnosed. At our appointment, she went over all of our test results, and she gave me another ultrasound where she also remarked on the strange difference between my 2 ovaries, but she said everything looked pretty normal. Because she knew I had endometriosis, she ordered another kind of imaging test called an HSG, which stands for, I cannot say this word, hysterosalpingogram. That's why they call it an HSG. This is a test where they inject a dye past your cervix and into your uterus, and the dye can be seen on an X-ray. They take a bunch of X-rays of your pelvis all in a row to see how the dye spreads through the uterus and hopefully out the open ends of the fallopian tubes. If the dye is stopped at any point in that journey, that means there's a blockage in the fallopian tube. I got the test a few days later, and the technician showed me the X-rays. And I did indeed have a blockage in my left fallopian tube that kept the dye from flowing freely out the end of the tube. Not only was the tube blocked, but it was dilated, which means that the tube looked more like a water balloon full of fluid than a little tube. When I asked the technician what causes these kinds of blockages, he listed off a few typical causes: scarring from prior abdominal surgery, untreated STIs, and then offhandedly asked, "Oh, do you have endometriosis?" And when I said yes, he said, "Oh, it's that then." So, not only was an egg from my ovary not able to travel through one of my fallopian tubes, meet a sperm, and get to my uterus, but even if an egg successfully made the journey through my good fallopian tube, met a sperm, and made it to my uterus, the fluid in that blocked and dilated fallopian tube would get into my uterus and either poison the embryo or just keep it from implanting because of all that fluid sloshing around. They actually don't know why it keeps you from getting pregnant, but they know that it does. Not only that, but having this blocked and dilated fallopian tube, which, by the way, is called a hydrosalpinx, meant that my risk of ectopic pregnancy was much, much higher. Which means the whole time we'd been trying to conceive for the last 9 months, we'd been playing with fire, which was pretty scary to learn. This HSG test had given me my very first actual evidence of specific damage that endometriosis had done to my body. After seeing the HSG images, my fertility doctor sent me a message advising me that the only way to treat a hydrosalpinx is laparoscopic surgery, and she recommended an endometriosis excision that would also remove the hydrosalpinx. I still don't understand why HSG tests are only given to patients who seek help with fertility. Endo is notoriously hard to see on imaging, and HSG tests are only slightly more invasive than vaginal ultrasounds. So why not order an HSG test when endo is suspected but nothing shows up on an ultrasound? Why had I never even heard of this imaging test before going to a fertility doctor? It makes me so angry to be living out the sadly typical story of a woman who doesn't get appropriate medical treatment until she's trying to have a baby. And suddenly her disease is then worth investigating and solving. Not so she has a better quality of life, but so her body can produce something. Finally having this evidence, this picture of the damage that endo had done to my body, finally having proof in my hands, made me ready to get surgery. Not just to be able to hopefully get pregnant in the future, but because I think I needed that proof before I was ready to commit to surgery. There was some part of me that still wasn't totally sure that I actually had endometriosis, that was very aware of the slim but real chance that all my symptoms were caused by something else, and that they'd cut me open and find nothing, and I'd have wasted so much money and time and have been wrong and foolish. This HSG test finally got rid of that last little doubting part of me. You know what we haven't done in a while? Taken a little break to listen to a little song about periods by an independent artist. I found a short but amazing one on TikTok the other day. Please enjoy.
Everything is AI and I'm still on my period. Climate change collapsing and I still get my period. I can't tell what's fake, what's real, I'm cramping from my period. The world is collapsing and I'm what? On my period. You'd think that by now we'd have evolved past a period. Maybe not the whole thing, but the pain of the period. But since we've got so many problems, geez, they are myriad. Let's create more robots and instead ignore the period.
That little ditty really sums up what it feels like to be alive as a menstruating person right now. That was Amanda Ribnick, and you can follow her on TikTok or Instagram for more amazing songs. Her last name is spelled Ribnick. Thank you, Amanda, for saying yes when a random podcaster asked your permission to feature your song. We are going to take another quick break, this one for ads, and we will be right back with the rest of my path to surgery.
'Cause we never really studied the female body.
Welcome back to CRAMPED. With this HSG test, I finally had definitive proof of the damage that endometriosis had done inside my body. The scarring from endometriosis had closed off my left fallopian tube, and it had filled with fluid. So I definitely had endometriosis, and I definitely needed surgery if I wanted to get rid of that fallopian tube and get my endo excised. The next step was choosing my surgeon. I really liked the endo specialist and surgeon who had initially diagnosed me, but after joining some endo communities on WhatsApp and Facebook and crowdsourcing some reviews and information firsthand, I heard a few really not great experiences from people who had gotten surgery with her. I ended up inquiring about another surgeon in her practice who I had heard great things about. He cost a little bit less, probably because he hasn't published a book or been on a lot of TV shows as an endo expert, despite his decades of experience and very good track record. And he had the availability to do the surgery within 6 weeks. After an initial Zoom appointment with the surgeon where the vibes were great, I scheduled the surgery with the practice's office, and I paid the $15,000 deposit. I think everybody has a different way of making these kinds of decisions. And for me, it was really important to not get stuck overanalyzing every element of the decision and second-guessing myself. I had gotten enough information to feel confident, and I moved forward. This surgeon looked at all of my imaging tests and my history, and he told me that he believed my blocked and dilated fallopian tube was actually what had been causing the majority of my severe period pain. Based on the imaging and my symptoms, he didn't expect to find a ton of widespread or deep infiltrating endometriosis lesions, but also acknowledged that you never know what you're going to find until you get in there. While I was scheduling my surgery, my partner was able to change our insurance from the not very good HMO that we had been on for a few years, which rhymes with Schmeiser, to a PPO that covered out-of-network providers. It's a more expensive monthly premium, and there's no guarantee that everything will be covered, even under the out-of-network coverage. But if he hadn't been able to change our insurance, we likely wouldn't have been able to afford this surgery. So that was a huge win. After surgery was scheduled, I was given a list of appointments to make and things to do before surgery. I needed to get medical clearance for surgery from my PCP, which involves physical and EKG and blood work, all just to make sure you're not going to die on the table from something they didn't catch. It was recommended to eat an anti-inflammatory diet for the 2 weeks before surgery, and I also chose to follow a low FODMAP diet because I know I'm prone to SIBO, and it's so common to have SIBO come back after surgery. I needed to meet with the general surgeon who was also going to be working on me to take out my appendix, and just in case anything went wrong with my other organs during surgery. I needed to sign very scary paperwork that listed out everything that could possibly go wrong and declare myself totally fine with it. I had to pay hospital fees and accept responsibility for any fees that my insurance didn't end up covering. It was really hard to understand how paying for the surgery would work. The surgery practice's front desk staff was incredibly helpful. I am so impressed and thankful for these women, because of course they're women, who fielded my confused and anxiety-ridden phone calls and emails, who kept me on top of my paperwork, and who were always willing to track down an answer for me if they didn't have it themselves. Truly, without them, no one would ever get surgery. So let's talk about cost, and I'm going to be completely transparent here. Ultimately, it doesn't seem like there was any way for me to be sure how much I was going to end up paying for surgery, because it's so dependent on how much insurance covers. So here is everything that I know at this point about the costs. My endosurgeon required a $15,000 deposit, like I said. This will be returned to me if my insurance pays them at least $65,000. My general surgeon required a $1,500 deposit that will not be refunded. If insurance doesn't pay him enough, and I don't know how much enough is, they will bill me for the balance. I had to prepay my hospital fees at Cedars-Sinai, which were $5,900. My PPO insurance has an in-network out-of-pocket maximum of $6,000, and luckily Cedars-Sinai Hospital is in-network, so that $5,900 payment to them goes towards that out-of-pocket maximum. My insurance has an out-of-network, out-of-pocket maximum of $23,000. The best case scenario is that my insurance covers the endosurgeon and the general surgeon as out-of-network providers, and that I only pay up to the out-of-pocket maximum. I still don't know if I have to pay both the in-network out-of-pocket maximum and the out-of-network out-of-pocket maximum. I assume so. So best case scenario, this surgery will eventually cost me about $30,000. I have paid all of the deposits out of my savings so far, and my savings are pretty much gone. My parents have offered to help pay for surgery, and I will probably take them up on that, especially if it winds up being something other than the best case scenario. And again, if my husband had not managed the incredible feat of changing our insurance last minute, This surgery likely would have cost over $100,000, which means I would not have been able to get the surgery at all. Can I afford a $30,000 surgery? Yeah, barely, with some help. Is it worth draining my savings for? I hope so. But I have no guarantee. To me, it's worth draining my savings to have a chance at a life without severe period pain, where I don't have to weigh the cost-benefit of having a piece of bread or traveling or going on a run against the risk of triggering a flare. But I'm very, very aware that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, basically at any other point in my life, I couldn't have afforded this. And my parents couldn't have afforded to help me. I'm very aware of how untenable this medical system is. That even with a good insurance, you have to pay $30,000 to treat a disease that 1 in 10 people with a uterus has. I am furious about it, even while I'm grateful to have the resources and the support system that makes this an option for me. All of this scheduling and getting these required appointments and paperwork done and wrapping my head around the cost and the insurance, all of that was finished about 2 weeks before the surgery. There wasn't much left for me to do but have anxiety. I wasn't anxious about the surgery itself. All I have to do is show up and get put under. What happened during surgery was out of my hands, so I wasn't anxious about it. I know that's not true about everybody, but for me, that's a relief. What I was anxious about was recovery. There were so many unknowns, and it made it so difficult to prepare for. My surgeon told me that the surgery could go anywhere from 3 to 7.5 hours, depending on what they found when they got in there. The longer the surgery goes and the more endo they find and excise, the longer and more difficult recovery could be. I searched for people's surgery experiences on TikTok and Instagram, and I found everything from day 5 of recovery, I had a movie night with all my friends, all the way to it took me 6 months to feel normal and not be in pain. I worried about nausea after surgery because I really didn't want to throw up after abdominal surgery. I worried about being able to sleep with incisions in my belly because I'm a side sleeper and I cannot sleep on my back. I worried a lot about how much my partner was going to need to do to take care of me during recovery, while also taking on 100% of the housework and taking care of our dog. I worried that he'd resent me if I took longer than a few days to recover. And to be clear, this is anxiety that was coming completely from my own issues with asking for and receiving help, not from anything he was saying or any of the evidence from the 7 years of our relationship. We talked a lot about it in couples therapy, and that is support that I'm really, really glad we had. The weekend before surgery was scheduled, we had a barbecue at our house. We told people this was my chance to see everybody before I disappeared into surgery and recovery for who knows how long. I put up a big piece of paper that said, Kate has trouble relaxing. Give her recommendations of stuff to watch and read during recovery. And I got dozens of really great recommendations. I got to feel so many friends around me and so much support, and it made me feel ready. I had big plans for the 2 days before surgery. I was going to cook up a couple soups, so at least my partner wouldn't have to cook for a couple days. I was going to set up the bed with my wedge pillow and the adjustable table I got and gather my Kindle and my computer and my books all into a little basket. I was going to put all my prescriptions and my over-the-counter meds for everything that I could think of that I might possibly experience. I was going to put all that in another basket next to the bed. We were going to have a fun day together before the chaos of surgery and the unpredictability of recovery. One last day as our normal selves before we had to take on very different roles for an unknown amount of time. And that's when my endometriosis made its hopefully last stand. I got my period early, and since I wasn't allowed to take ibuprofen or any other NSAIDs for the 2 weeks leading up to the surgery because they're anticoagulants and could lead to excessive bleeding during the surgery, I had full-on death cramps. 8 hours of throwing up every 20 minutes and passing out from the pain in between. My partner was on the phone with the endo surgeon who kept suggesting different meds to try, but I kept throwing them up. Eventually, we ended up at the ER where, after waiting another 2 hours, throwing up into those little puke bags, I was given IV morphine and an anti-nausea medication, and then I was told that the cyclical vomiting had been caused by the 3 milligram edible that I had taken 48 hours earlier. So dumb. So the day before surgery became more about recovering from full-blown, never-ending death cramps than preparing my space and myself and my partner for surgery. He took on the caregiver role 2 days earlier than planned, and we didn't get to do that transition the way we wanted to. It was hard for me, and I know it was hard for him too, but I was so grateful to have a partner who could deal with this unexpected complication with the surgery looming right there on the horizon. That brings us to the day of surgery, and I will pick it up here next episode for a full rundown of the surgery, recovery so far, and all the answers that I finally got after surgery. I hope this was interesting to listen to. It's really just telling you what happened one thing after another, but I wish that I had had this kind of thorough, transparent, detailed experience laid out for me before I got surgery. I think it would have made the process a lot less stressful. So if you're out there and you're trying to figure out how to get to surgery, or you're having trouble making the decision, reach out. I would be happy to talk to you about this and answer any other questions that you have. If you are a part of the Patreon, which I would love for you to be a part of and support this work, you can message me through Patreon at patreon.com/cramped. You can also reach out to me on Instagram at Kate Helen Downey or email me at crampedpodcast@gmail.com. See you next time. Cramped is hosted and created by me, Kate Helen Downey. Kelsey DeLonzo is our editorial producer. Sound design and mixing is by Kelly Kramerick at Maven Post Media. Cramped's incredible theme song is written and performed by Faraday. Our podcast art was created by Nicholas Shepard. If this podcast has been useful or helpful to you, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave us a review. We are an independent podcast, and taking just a minute to rate and review, it genuinely helps other people find us who might need this information.
What's happening to your body? We don't know because we've never really studied the female body.